Yes.
Lord Horam, we're going to look now at your letter of the 1st of October 1996 to the Reverend Tanner. Lawrence, could we have HSOC 00-23572, please? So the letter is dated the 1st of October 1996, and if we pick it up in the second paragraph, I'm sorry that it's taken so long for me to respond formally, but I'm sure you will appreciate that I needed to consider very carefully your proposals and their implications before deciding whether it would be right to alter our position on the question of compensation. After much thought, I have concluded that it would not be appropriate to offer financial compensation to haemophiliacs who have been infected with hepatitis C. I will explain my reasons for this, but I should first stress that I shall continue to listen to the arguments and look at other ways in which we can provide help. I hope that I've already made very clear my deep sympathy for all those affected by this inadvertent tragedy. I've been very touched by the real problems that they clearly face, and I'm committed to doing what I can to help. In considering whether compensation is the right way to do this, 2 points have been apparent. First, we do not accept that there's been negligence on the part of the NHS. Tragic though it is that the very treatment designed to help those patients infected should have caused them harm, there can be no question that they received the best treatment available at the time. That treatment was essential for their survival. As you know, we take a view that compensation is only appropriate where there has been negligence. If we were to provide compensation on the basis of non-negligent harm, this would very quickly develop into a general no-fault compensation scheme, which would be both unworkable and unfair. This is a point that was considered in relation to the settlement for HIV cases. On that occasion, we were convinced by the very special nature of the disease and by arguments that it would not lead to further similar claims for compensation. Over the page. Second, all the proposals for compensation, and you will be aware that I've considered a wide range of options, involve the expenditure of substantial sums of public money. I have a duty to consider the effect of such a sizable sum on other health service expenditure. That duty has led me to conclude that funds that are available to the NHS from whatever source are best used in direct patient care. You will also be aware that suggestions have been made for funding compensation from sources other than the NHS budget, and I have given these careful consideration. Although theoretically possible, funding through the commercial sector or the National Lottery are not matters in which it would be appropriate for me to seek to exert influence. The first would be a matter for any companies involved, and the second for the Independent National Lotteries Board. And then you go on to deal with a range of other matters which have been raised by the Haemophilia Society, including research into hepatitis C, issues about availability of treatments such as alpha interferon, and so on. And I'm not proposing to read those out. If we can go back to the first page then, Lord Horam, and just unpick some of the reasoning that was put forward. The fourth paragraph, where you talk about your deep sympathy for all those affected, you use the phrase, by this inadvertent tragedy. Now, inadvertent might be said to suggest that this was unavoidable, it was bad luck, that it was nobody's fault. Do you recall reflecting on the use of the word inadvertent, or what you meant by saying it was an inadvertent tragedy?
Well, it was a tragedy which was not meant to happen, but did.
If we then pick it up in the next paragraph, you say there what I think are probably two separate things. First of all, don't accept that there's been negligence on the part of the NHS. Now, negligence is a legal term of art, as it were, and I'm not proposing to ask you specifically in relation to that. But you go on to say this, and it's reflected in all the documents that have been provided to you by officials. You go on to say, no question, that they received the best treatment available at the time. Now, that's obviously what officials had said to you, as we've seen. Would you expect there to have been a proper evidential basis for that assertion? In other words, that your officials would have investigated the matter and had some factual basis for asserting that everyone was treated with the best treatment available at the time?
Yes.
Did you ever question whether that could be stated so confidently, or what the basis for it was?
No, I didn't. I trusted their judgment.
It might be said that the positive assertion that not only was there not negligence, but that it was the best treatment available, treatment essential for survival, was painting a very rosy picture, a very idyllic picture. If and this is a hypothetical, because this isn't something officials ever said to you, but if your officials had said to you, had given you a more warts and all picture, for example, saying, we don't know what patients were told about the risks at the time, or there are question marks over whether screening or testing could have been introduced more quickly, or there are question marks over whether the procedures for excluding high-risk blood donors were effective. If those kind of more nuanced potential concerns have been drawn to your attention, what do you think you would have done in response? Would you have wanted to know more, at least?
Yes, I want more information. What were the facts?
And that, presumably, if there had been this rather more nuanced picture, it might have given you a more solid foundation for pushing back against the departmental and Treasury resistance.
Indeed. I mean, it was a bit black and white, wasn't it?
Yes. And looking back now, Lord Horam, with the benefit of having seen not just the material that was given to you by officials at the time, but some of what was going on behind the scenes, looking back, was it, in your view, appropriate for the department to be making blanket statements that thousands of individuals treated by different doctors at different hospitals at different times were all given the best treatment?
Well, it's a big statement, isn't it?
Yes.
Perhaps too big a statement. But I'm not in a position to judge that. I wasn't in a position to judge that.
So you would essentially, as a junior minister, have taken it on trust?
Exactly.
But you would have expected that at some stage officials would have done the work to assure themselves that what they were telling you was correct?
Yes.
And you don't know whether that happened?
No.
If we just go back to the top of the next page. The issue at the top of the page is about expenditure of substantial sums of public money. And you say there, you concluded that funds that are available to the NHS from whatever source are best used in direct patient care. Now, you don't expressly here deal with the possibility of the Treasury being approached to allow access to the contingency reserve.
No, I don't.
Do you know why that isn't expressly dealt with here? Was that something still under consideration, or do you not know?
I don't think it was. I don't think it was ever a possibility. I was not aware of it being a possibility.
And when you say not aware of it being a possibility, do you mean that you don't think the Treasury would have responded favourably if approached, or you didn't know that you could approach the Treasury?
I don't think they would have responded favourably, given that there were obviously going to be many calls on the contingency funds.
Now, obviously, if we go back to the previous page, bottom paragraph, what's set out there is the concern about the slippery slope. That's not the phrase you use there, but the risk that there would become a general no-fault compensation scheme. Why was that such a concern? In the sense, why Why was the department so convinced, it would appear in what they were saying to you at least, that this might lead to a general no-fault compensation scheme?
Because of the logic of going step by step, from going from HIV to Hep C to other conditions, like medicines, like surgical procedures, radiological procedures. If you could see if no negligence had occurred, but compensation was made, there's a whole variety of health procedures that could be brought into play.
Your question said might. The letter says would develop. So it's rather more bullish upon the possibility of what a lawyer might call a floodgates argument coming into effect than the question. And your answer, I think, answered the might, because you
Yes.
said it could lead to this, it could lead to that. What do you say about the assertion that it would develop?
Well, I agree, that's more problematic, isn't it? I mean, that is speculation. With hindsight, that's probably not been borne out.
Yeah, no. Well, I've likened it to floodgates argument in
Yes.
amongst lawyers, and the judge sitting in court quite often hears floodgate arguments as an argument for not accepting a particular case that's been put forward. Sometimes they succeed, but that's probably, and the lawyers here can make submit to me if I think I've got this wrong, but in general, floodgates arguments are a last refuge of a desperate defendant, and don't quite so often succeed. Sometimes, as I say, they do, but it's not by any means a generality. But there we are.
With hindsight, that would have been better phrased as might well very quickly develop rather
Yes.
than would.
Yeah.
And I think you say in your statement, Lord Horam, that perhaps in hindsight that assessment was too pessimistic.
Yes.
And it's right to note, I think, that the settlement of the HIV claims had not led to a general no-fault compensation scheme.
No, it hadn't.
It might be said that the department's focus was very much on trying to distinguish HIV from hepatitis C and say there were special features of HIV, rather than focusing on what they had in common. Would that be a fair comment?
Yes.
And the line could it not have been held at saying, well, this is a scheme, because of the scale of the tragedy, a scheme where the relevant cohort are those infected through blood and blood products.
Yes.
The consequences of HIV obviously were horrific, but the department knew, your colleagues knew, that hepatitis C could also be fatal, could it not?
Absolutely.
Looking at it again now, would you say that the risk of dying of hepatocellular cancer might have been sufficient to make hepatitis C too a special case?
I don't know about your point about cancer. I'm not sure.
Well, hepatitis C, as we saw from the Haemophilia Society report, could lead to
I see.
chronic liver disease,
Right.
cirrhosis, and cancer.
Yeah.
So let me put it this way, Lord Horam, if the department had been more open to the idea of the provision of financial support to those with hepatitis C, there were ways in which it could be said that that this is a special case too.
I take your point.
Can I then just pick up a handful of further documents with you, not very many more. Not long after let's pick up the Reverend Tanner's response, first of all, to your letter. HSOC 0014299, please, Lawrence. This was the Reverend Tanner, 3rd of October 1996 to you. And in the second paragraph, he says this: while I acknowledge the work that's being undertaken by various agencies to improve understanding of HCV and identify effective treatment, I am deeply disappointed by your response to our request for financial help for people with haemophilia infected with hepatitis C. The Haemophilia Society has never suggested that there has been negligence on the part of the NHS. We asked you to make an ex gratia payment to people with haemophilia who've been infected with HCV through contaminated blood products, and to establish a trust fund to meet their financial needs and those of their dependents. We consider this the minimum required to alleviate immediate needs. Neither is the Haemophilia Society seeking compensation. We asked for a compassionate approach to the strong moral arguments involved. We do not accept that such an approach would set a precedent for no-fault compensation. And then the letter goes on to talk about differences and similarities between HIV and hepatitis C, and to suggest the position, the example again given of the brothers, the position to be morally indefensible. But what role did compassion or the moral case for resistance play in the department's thinking at the time, if any?
Well, I think that the moral case was, this is money spent, however you describe it, whether it's an ex gratia payment or compensation, it's money spent. How is this money best spent on treatment and patient care or on compensation? I would say that's the moral element in the government's position.
And compassion?
Same thing.
I think you had said in terms back in the December of the previous year in the parliamentary debates that, having heard what Mr. Marshall and others had to say and having great sympathy, you wanted to look at things in more detail, and we've seen how you sought to do that over the months that followed. In the options that were mapped out for you by officials, to what extent was a moral case for assistance given any weight by your officials?
Not a lot is the answer to that, I think.
And would it be fair to say,
other than what I've stated,
yes,
that the money could be only spent once and it had to be spent on patient care?
Yes. And you're absolutely right that there are references to, if that comes out of the health budget, it has potential implications for direct patient care. And you're right that point emerges in the contemporaneous documentation. But the primary focus, I suggest to you, from the documentation we've looked at from the department, might be said to be twofold: the consequences for government and the fiscal implications. Would that be fair?
Yes, the precedent issue, the slippery slope issue, and the financial consequences.
Now, can I then just ask you to look at HSOC 0008602? This is the transcript of a documentary for which I think you were interviewed.
Mm-hmm.
And just to put it, I think in a fair context, what you say in your statement, and I'll just read this out, I don't think we need to put it on screen, but in paragraph 2.69 of your statement, you say, I was asked to appear on a World in Action documentation broadcast on 7th of October 1996 to set out the government's position in relation to treatment for hepatitis C sufferers. This was my first appearance on a television broadcast as a health minister. I was allowed a very short amount of time to answer a small number of questions put to me as part of the wider broadcast. So that was how it came about. If we go, please, Lawrence, to page 6. want to pick it up in the bottom half of the page. You've got the heading COM, says a single dose of factor VIII is made by concentrating the clotting agent from thousands of blood donations. In 1975, WIA, that's World in Action, first exposed how American down and outs were contaminating Britain's blood products. And that's a reference to a 1975 documentary by World in Action. And then what we see under the heading Archive.com is an extract from that 1975 documentary, which talks about money, blood being sold, bought from men who need money, down on the skid rows of America's big cities. And it talks about paid donors carrying 6 to 13 times the risk of having hepatitis as volunteer donors, and they can pass it on. If we then go to the bottom of the next page, please. We can pick up at the very bottom of the page, again under the heading COM, and this is now the 1996 documentary again. Many similarities have been drawn between HIV and hepatitis C. They're both transmitted in blood and blood products like factor VIII. In 1990, the full effects of hepatitis C were not yet known, but HIV-positive haemophiliacs were dying of AIDS at the rate of 1 a week. Public opinion forced the government to set up a multi-million-pound compensation fund. And then, if we just go down the page a little, the documentary then shows John Major speaking in the House in December 1990, making that announcement. And then we get to the heart of the issue in 1996. The compensation only covered HIV victims infected before 1985. After that, all factor VIII was heat-treated, reducing the risk of viral contamination. Now the 3,000 haemophiliacs who were infected with hepatitis C from the same contaminated blood products want compensation too. Today, the government turned them down. And this is where we then get some of your answers. At the end of the day, and this is you, I have to say it is better to spend money on healthcare, direct patient, on top of the next page, care for haemophiliacs with hepatitis C, or indeed anybody else who is ill, rather than compensation. And that, I think, probably reflects the point you made a few moments ago, Lord Horam. And then if we go back to the page, please. There's then an intervention of an individual who was infected with hepatitis C. And then what's said is this: I think that documentary, that's the 1975 documentary, should be shown again. And all the government should be made to watch it and see exactly where those blood products came from. Just pausing there, did you ever watch the 1975 documentary, Lord Horam? Do you know whether before or after this programme?
I can't recall.
And then it said, someone says they should give exactly the same as they did for the haemophiliacs with HIV, exactly the same. All the haemophiliacs contracted hepatitis C as a result of receiving factor VIII through the NHS. And then you say yes, but, and then if we go over the page, I'm not sure what the reference to 30,000 is, but then we see the slightly longer answer from you. Yes, remember they're alive first of all. I mean, they've had the gift of life from the blood products they received. And in addition, some of them have indeed got hepatitis C. But first of all, they are alive. And secondly, the onset of hepatitis C, while very severe, in the case of probably 1 in 5, undoubtedly indeed leading to cirrhosis of the liver and death. In many others, is not so severe. So let's look at it in perspective. Now, that reference to having the gift of life from blood products suggests that your understanding was that the factor concentrates had been life-saving for the patients who received it. Was that your understanding at the time, do you think?
Yeah.
And that understanding is something you would have gleaned from officials rather than your own separate knowledge?
Yes, indeed.
So would it be right then to... I think you told us previously you weren't aware, for example, of an alternative treatment, cryoprecipitate.
No, I wasn't.
Do you remember officials ever telling you that there were not just severe haemophiliacs who might sometimes have a life-threatening bleed? I emphasise sometimes, but not invariably. But there were also moderate and mild haemophiliacs who could potentially be treated in different ways. Were those kind of matters ever drawn to your attention as far as
No,
you
they
can
weren't.
And then we can see it continues towards the bottom of the page that the Haemophilia Society will continue to fight for compensation, and they're now joined by another group of people also infected with hepatitis C, patients who've been given contaminated blood transfusions. But I don't think there's anything particular further in your answers that I need to explore with you. Can we then pick up the parliamentary debate at the end of 1996, which you referred to earlier, Lord Horam? This is at DHSC 0041255_130. So this is the 11th of December 1996, so it's almost exactly a year on from the debate that we looked at this morning. We can see it starts with a speech from Mr. Marshall, and if we look at the right-hand column, the third paragraph onwards, we can see Mr. Marshall identifying possible areas of fault. So he says the origin of the problem goes back to the 1970s when there was a failure to screen imported blood products. My view is that demonstrated negligence on the part of the Department of Health. It was known at the time that in the United States, blood donors were paid for giving blood. Those who feel so hard up that they give pints of blood for money include drug addicts and others whose blood may well be infected. The Department of Health must have known of those risks. And then if we skip over the next paragraph and go to the one after. So we're discussing the issue in the 1990s because there was some negligence and complacency in the 1970s. And then if we go to the next paragraph, please, Lawrence. Again, this is all from Mr. Marshall's speech. The justification for giving assistance to haemophiliacs with HIV was that they faced a suspended sentence of death. Indeed, many died fairly quickly of full-blown acquired immune deficiency syndrome. Others have lingered on, and such are the advances in medical science, some may do so for many years to come. All who have lived have done so not knowing how long they would live. Many found it difficult to get a job and certainly difficult to get a mortgage. Of course, in the case of hepatitis C, there is a difference, but it is only of degree. Some of those infected with hepatitis C have already died. Others will die prematurely. There's been no official estimate. And then he goes on to deal with lack of an estimate on the part of Department of Health, or what's said to be a lack of an estimate, and his own estimate. And then if we go bottom of the page, Mr. Marshall talks about the hardship suffered by those with hepatitis C. I don't think I need to read that out. If we go to the next page, and we pick it up in the left-hand column, fourth paragraph down. So having referred again to the case of the three brothers, Mr. Marshall says one would need the intellectual casuistry of a Treasury mandarin to justify such an action, to say that one death is worthy of compensation, but that another is worth nothing at all is heartless and intellectually barren. It is not only grieving relatives who find the differential unacceptable and immoral. More than 270 members of Parliament have signed early day motion 4 asking for compensation to be paid. The vast bulk of decent people find the differential unacceptable. And then if we go further down that column, please. In the second paragraph on the screen, Mr. Marshall says this: when my honourable friend the Minister was asked earlier this year whether he would provide help, he argued that the Department of Health budget should be used for patient care. Everyone accepts that the Secretary of State and his ministers should try to protect the Department of Health budget, but the argument that help should be denied because the health budget must be protected is intellectually threadbare and immoral. We all know that when the Macfarlane Trust was set up, for which measure our right honourable friend the Leader of the House was responsible, no one said that the money would have to come out of the Department of Health's budget. There is a thing called the contingency fund that can be used to bail out departments in such circumstances. And then reference is made to the use of the contingency fund previously. And then if we go to the same page, please, Lawrence, but the top of the right-hand column. Thank you. Second paragraph, Mr Marshall says, therefore, we have to look to the future. There would be merit in setting up an inquiry to hear what outside experts say about the number of people who will die and the extent of the hardship created, and so on. So a passionate speech by Mr Marshall,
Indeed.
echoed just further down by Alf Morris. And he says this in the second paragraph, third line, the achievement of elementary justice for some very needful people is at the heart of our campaign, which, as the Honourable Member said, is now supported by more than 270 members of Parliament of all parties. Our campaign is also about morality. The government accepted their moral responsibility in the case of HIV infection in the course of National Health Service treatment. They now have the same responsibility in the hepatitis C cases. And he asserts it's morally wrong to deny the victims of this appalling further tragedy in the haemophilia community the modest help they seek. So those are the speeches to which you then responded, Lord Horam. We can see that just further down the same column, where you observe it's almost exactly a year since we had a similar debate on this subject. Again, I'm not going to read all of it, but if we can go to the next page. You repeat, and we see it, for example, in the third paragraph on the left-hand side. You repeat the information that we've seen set out in the departmental documents and the letter to the relevant Tanner. So the best treatment available in light of medical knowledge at the time. I think you say the same later in the speech. What I just want to do finally in this is, if we look on the same page, Lawrence, bottom of the right-hand column, and this is, I think, setting out your position, the department's position in terms of financial support. As of December 96, you say, the Haemophilia Society subsequently wrote to me in June asking for the government to set up a trust fund, and so on. I took time to consider these proposals carefully before applying to the Haemophilia Society in October. Most honourable members will by now be aware that I did not accept the Society's proposals for payments for those infected with hepatitis C, but I stressed that I remained open to further arguments. I also outlined the support that we're giving to work with those infected and to research in the area. And then, third paragraph, you reject the suggestion that there has been negligence. You repeat the concern about development of a general no-fault compensation scheme. And then the next paragraph, you say we're not convinced that hepatitis C falls into the same special category. And then, if I can just read the paragraph beginning secondly. Secondly, as my honourable friend said, all the proposals for payment schemes involve the expenditure of substantial sums of public money. I have considered a wide range of options for such schemes. I really have done that, including the possibility of a scheme limited to those who go on to develop cirrhosis only. But they all have significant costs. As a health minister, I have a duty to consider the effect of such a sizable sum on other health service expenditure. That duty has led me to conclude that the funds that are available to the NHS from whatever source are best used in direct patient care. So that is you, is it not on the record, also saying that the Marshall scheme, the more modest proposal, is also rejected?
Yes.
And is it right to understand that was essentially for the same reasons as the reasons set out in your letter to the Reverend Tanner?
Yes.
Before you read this, could I just come back to what is said at the top of this column? Thank you. It's in the second substantive paragraph down on that page. It's first we do not accept. If you can highlight that, please. First we do not accept. Down to the word negligence, the whole paragraph, please. Whole paragraph, please. Thank you. And can we make that any larger or not? Thank you. It's this, after the best treatment, which Council's already asked you about, available at the time, we see 4 lines up from the bottom. That treatment was essential for their survival. Now, she's dealt with that. But then there are these words, there was no alternative. So that was the information that you were given by your civil servants, that there was no alternative,
Correct.
but that they should be given factor 8.
That's correct.
Thank you.
The final point that I wanted to pick up, Lord Horam, about this parliamentary speech is it's the bottom of the left-hand column and then the top of the right. So if we just pick it up at the bottom of the left-hand column. It's the last paragraph. It's been suggested, it was reiterated today by my honourable friend, that there should be funding compensation sources other than from the National Health Service budget. Naturally, I'm sympathetic to that suggestion. Given their knowledge of how the government work, on and right on members who've spoken in this debate will understand that those matters are not within the compass of my duties as Health Minister, and they must look to other ministers to put their case, particularly as regards the contingency fund. And then you refer to the National Lottery, and for reasons I don't need to explore with you because they're perhaps obvious, the position is that's a matter to pursue through the National Lottery if anyone wants to. But it's the suggestion that it would be for other ministers to put a case as regards to the contingency fund. Do you know what you meant by that?
I think probably I got that wrong, to be honest. I think it was really my responsibility if in retrospect, with hindsight, I probably got that wrong. It was probably my responsibility to do that if I was convinced there was a case for the contingency fund, and I don't really know why I said other ministers, to be honest.
And either yours or yours to persuade Mr. Dorrell and for
Yes,
Mr.
well,
Dorrell
quite. Yes, exactly,
to put
yeah.
the case. Now, we've seen, we can take that down, thank you, Lawrence, we've seen what was being said by the Treasury in communications with the Department. We've seen the views of the Permanent Secretary, the resistance, it might be said, of civil servants within the Department. Do you recall any discussions on this issue with the Secretary of State himself, Mr. Dorrell?
No, I don't, but I would have been surprised if we didn't have discussions, given that I think I mentioned we probably had 3 meetings a week, the so-called breakfast meetings, that this had not come up. I mean, you were really, given that it was a big issue and there were real problems in addressing it, it would greatly surprise me if we hadn't discussed it at some stage, but I have no evidence to that effect.
I'm just going to ask you to look at one document. It predates your time as Minister, Lord Horam. So you'll recall in a couple of the documents that we've looked at, there's reference to the Secretary of State having given evidence to a Health Select Committee in July of 1995. And I just want to look at an extract of that with you and then just explore a point with you. So it's DHSC 00-42937 _094. We can see the second paragraph. Actually, I'm sorry, Lawrence, let's just put the first paragraph up, otherwise it doesn't make sense. So this is, I think, potentially Mr. Marshall again. And he asks some questions about matters I don't need to trouble you with, about the organisation of the blood service and purchase of blood bags. And then this question, would you like to comment on your views as to whether those who suffer a premature death through contaminated blood products or contaminated blood should be compensated? And then Mr. Dole says, may I deal with the last question first? My first exchange as a health minister some years ago now with Mr. Marshall was on this subject in an earlier case. I believe that it remains true now, as I asserted then, that there is a choice to be made about whether the health service uses its resources to compensate those who've suffered, but through no fault of the health service, where there's been a breakdown but without fault, whether that is a higher priority than the treatment of today's and tomorrow's patients. I said then, and I still believe it very strongly to be true, that any patient who undertakes a course of medicine must accept that there's a risk attached to modern medicine, and in cases where a patient is damaged but without any fault, I do not believe that it is a sensible use of NHS resources to provide compensation in these cases. Of course, that is in no sense to undermine the quite proper obligation that rests when things go wrong through somebody's negligence. Where there is no fault, I am not in favour of compensation as a principle. And then if we go to the next page, bottom half of the page, someone, it may be Mr Marshall again, I don't know, I don't think it matters, says, can I go back to the first part of the answer? Would you not agree there's something illogical when those who've suffered early death through HIV are compensated, but sometimes within the same family, another haemophiliac suffered an early death through cirrhosis of the liver, through hepatitis C, and has received no compensation at all? Do you not think that is worthy of re-examination, particularly as there are so few people involved? And then this was Mr Dorrell's answer. I cannot deny that there is an illogicality there, because the haemophiliac who contracted AIDS as a result of blood transfusion was provided with compensation in contravention of the principle which I enunciated to the committee. We can only give the guarantee that there will be no illogicality if we extend the same form of compensation more generally than we have yet done, and I'm not in favour of doing that for the reason I gave to the committee. Two matters arising out of that, Lord Horam, and recognising as I do that this predates by a few months your arrival, but it's still Mr Dorrell who's Secretary of State when you're there. Mr Dorrell appears to accept that there was no particularly good reason for, or to accept at least as an illogicality in treating differently the HIV sufferer from the hepatitis C sufferer. Do you recall whether that potential illogicality was something that was ever discussed with him by you?
No, I don't recall that, to be honest.
And then, secondly, it might be inferred from what he's saying here that he thought that the government had already gone too far in providing what he calls compensation to those who had contracted AIDS. Was that something of you that you ever recall him raising with you or discussing with you?
No.
Do you recall whether this issue, the issue that we've been exploring today, was something that was ever raised by you with Baroness Cumberledge?
No.
No, that you don't, as in you don't recall it? Or you...
I don't recall it.
We can take that down, thank you, Lawrence. Can I then just really put a couple of general propositions to you for your comment, Lord Horam? It might be said that the government, in considering the issue in the way that we've explored today, focused on attempts to hold the line, avoid the slippery slope, and maintain that distinction between HIV and hepatitis C, to the extent that it lost sight of the desperate circumstances of those whose lives have been devastated by infection. Do you have any comment on that?
I don't think it lost sight of the desperate circumstances of those who've been infected, or those who've been or their relatives and friends. I don't think it lost sight of that, but I think that it was concerned about the slippery slope. That was uppermost in its mind. There's a tension between the two, I agree, but I think the slippery slope argument was uppermost in its mind.
Final area of question, Lord Horam, is just about the possibility of there being some form of inquiry or investigation. There was a passing reference to it, I think, in that last parliamentary debate we looked at from Mr Marshall, suggesting at least an inquiry looking at the circumstances of those infected, and I think not necessarily suggesting a more far-reaching inquiry. Your evidence in your statement, as I understand it, is that you don't remember anyone raising with you the possibility of having some form of formal inquiry or investigation into what might have gone wrong, what might have led to the infection of so many people.
No, apart from this mention in his speech, no one mentioned that to me.
And would it be right to understand that it's not something that occurred to you proactively to raise?
No, that's correct. I wasn't. I mean, I was more concerned all throughout this period to see if there was some, as say, more modest proposal that was acceptable. Given that I was tied, as it were, to the overall position of the government on this, I was looking if there was some compromise, however small, which could give some hope to people that there was a way forward.
So those are the questions I'm currently proposing to ask Lord Horam. A little longer, I'm afraid, than the half an hour I said before lunch. Could we take a 30-minute break now? And that, I think, should be enough for core participants and legal representatives to suggest any further questions.
Yes, well, if I say not before 3:15, then that gives the opportunity, should it be longer, for Lord Horam to be told.
Yes.
In his room and for others to be informed. But so not before 3:15.
Thank you, sir.